In the 1975 playoffs, George McGinnis averaged 32.3 points, 15.9 rebounds, and 8.2 assists across 18 games. One night, he produced 51 points, 17 rebounds, and 10 assists. Across the full postseason, he led every player in total points, rebounds, and assists. It was one of the most overwhelming playoff runs professional basketball had seen. And it did not end with a championship.
Indiana lost the league finals to Kentucky. McGinnis walked away from a historic individual performance without the title, then entered a contract battle that became nearly as dramatic as anything he had done on the floor. He signed with the New York Knicks, only to have the agreement voided by Larry O'Brien in the new commissioner's first official act. That sequence captures the strange shape of George McGinnis's career.
He was an ABA champion and most valuable player, an All-NBA first-team selection, and a physical force opponents openly feared. Yet his greatest postseason was overshadowed by defeat. His chosen contract was erased, and his Hall of Fame call did not arrive until 35 years after his final professional game. The forgetting was not caused by disgrace or a lack of evidence. The evidence is almost excessive. Championships, scoring, rebounding, playmaking, and numbers that later stars would need decades to match. The problem was that much of his prime happened in a league whose history was absorbed imperfectly after the merger, while the later years brought injuries, trades, and a homecoming that could not restore the player Indianapolis remembered. Before he became that feared professional, McGinnis was a teenage phenomenon in basketball-mad Indiana. His perfect senior season made him a local myth, but the celebration unfolded beside a family loss no scoreboard could measure. That collision between dominance and private pain began long before professional basketball learned how complicated his story would become. He was born in Alabama, but Indianapolis made him. And if you understand one thing about Indianapolis, understand this. In that city, in that state, high school basketball is not a pastime. It is close to a religion. Gyms pack out on winter nights. Local legends get talked about for generations. So when a kid starts dominating in Indiana, the whole community feels it. George McGinnis grew up in that world, and he attended Washington High School, where he turned into the kind of player people drove across town to watch. He was big, he was fast, and he could simply impose himself on a game in a way that teenagers are not supposed to be able to do. The 1969 season made him a myth. McGinnis, alongside his teammate Steve Downing, led Washington to a perfect record, 31 wins and 0 losses, and a state championship. In basketball-obsessed Indiana, a perfect season with a title is the kind of achievement that gets carved into local memory permanently. And the individual numbers were just as loud. According to accounts of his high school career, McGinnis set an Indiana State Tournament scoring record with 148 points across his final 4 tournament games. That same year, he was named Indiana Mr. Basketball, the highest individual honor a high school player in that state can receive. In a place that produces serious talent every single year, being called the best meant something real. Champion, Mr. Basketball, the whole city watching him, the whole future wide open. But somewhere in the middle of that golden run, a phone call came that had nothing to do with basketball. His father would not live to see how the story ended. During McGinnis's senior season, the same stretch of months when he was carrying a perfect team toward a championship,
His father, Bernie, passed away in a construction accident. Think about the collision of those two realities. On one side, a young man being celebrated like a hero, his name in every local headline, his future being mapped out by coaches and recruiters. On the other side, a family in mourning, a funeral, an absence that nothing on a court could fill. A teenager does not get to choose which of those two things to feel. He has to hold both at once, the public glory and the private grief, and keep showing up. We will not pretend to know everything that went on inside him during that time. But it is fair to say this was a formative pressure point, the kind of early loss that shapes how a person carries weight for the rest of his life. There is another detail about McGinnis from those years that surprises almost everyone who hears it. He did not consider basketball his best sport. He later said his best sport was probably football. He played wide receiver and defensive end, both ends of the field. And yet he admitted he didn't even enjoy football as much as he enjoyed basketball. Sit with that for a second. The sport he became famous for, the sport that made him a champion, the sport that would carry him to the professional ranks. That was not even, in his own estimation, where his raw physical gifts peaked. That tells you everything about the kind of athlete we are talking about. A body built for collision, for speed, for power, that happened to be pointed at a basketball. And that physical dominance was about to explode onto the national stage. He would reach the college level, and he would only need a single season to start rewriting the record books. McGinnis enrolled at Indiana University, and he played the 1970 to 1971 season under head coach Lou Watson. There was a small, almost haunting piece of timing tucked into that fact. McGinnis played for the Hoosiers the year before the program hired Bob Knight, the coach who would go on to define Indiana basketball for decades. So McGinnis is this brief flash in the program's history, a what-if that arrived just slightly too early to share the spotlight with the man who made the school a national power. But he did not need anyone's spotlight. He created his own. In that lone season with the Hoosiers, McGinnis averaged nearly 30 points a game, 29.9 to be precise. And according to accounts of his college career, he became the first sophomore ever to lead the Big Ten in both scoring and rebounding in the same season. Not one or the other, both. Leading an entire major conference in the two categories that define physical impact as a sophomore is the kind of stat line that should have made him a fixture in college basketball lore. And then he was gone. One season and out. McGinnis left college to turn professional, a man already in too much of a hurry to stick around. You can read that decision two ways. You can call it impatience, or you can call it the simple truth. He was already too big for the level he was playing at, and everybody could see it. But here is where the story takes its first real turn toward the wilderness. McGinnis did not go to the established NBA. He chose the rival league with the red, white, and blue basketball, the upstart many people in the older organization treated as a noisy sideshow. In that league, George McGinnis became one of the most powerful players in professional basketball. The league he joined was the American Basketball Association, the ABA. And for the younger fans, or anyone who needs a refresher, it is worth slowing down to explain what that actually meant. The ABA was built to challenge convention. It used a red, white, and blue ball, embraced the three-point line, and turned the slam dunk into a spectacle. It played faster, sold personality more aggressively, and survived by signing talent the NBA wanted for itself. The competition was not merely about style. It became a war over salaries, markets, and which league had the right to define a star. The cost became clearer after the leagues merged. ABA records did not always receive the same attention. Its games had reached a smaller national audience, and many of its greatest nights survived without the visual archive attached to NBA history. A player could dominate real professionals, win real championships, and still discover that later generations treated part of his prime like a separate language they were never taught to read. McGinnis signed with the Indiana Pacers, his hometown franchise, in the city that had already turned him into a legend as a teenager. And he did not need time to adjust. He immediately became one of the marquee names of the entire league. His style was the whole point. He was a forward who could rebound, run the floor, score from everywhere, and physically bully a game in a way that people described as ahead of its time. He had a body that did not fit the era's idea of what a forward was supposed to be, and he used it to dominate. Across his ABA career, he would average 25.2 points and 12.9 rebounds over 314 games. Production that in any league demands respect. And in just his first 2 professional seasons, McGinnis was not going to merely compete. He was going to win championships and earn a playoff's most valuable player honor that, by all rights, should have made him a household name forever. Here is a question worth asking right at the start. What does most basketball royalty have on its resume? Championships won early, often, and convincingly. Now look at what George McGinnis did the moment he turned professional. He did not pay dues for years. He did not wait his turn. He walked in and started lifting trophies. In his first 2 professional seasons with the Indiana Pacers, McGinnis played a central role on back-to-back championship teams. Not a role player riding along, a force. A young star helping deliver titles in his hometown, in the same city that had crowned him a high school legend. That is the kind of opening act most remembered greats would trade almost anything to have on their record. And the second of those titles came with a personal stamp. In the 1973 playoffs, McGinnis was named the most valuable player of the postseason. Across 18 playoff games, he averaged 23.9 points and 12.3 rebounds, carrying the Pacers to a repeat championship. Read that line again. Almost 24 points and better than 12 boards a night in the games that matter most, as the most important player on a champion. That is a superstar's playoff run by any honest measure. So here is where the deeper mystery of this whole story really begins to take shape. If he was this decorated, this early, 2 titles and a playoffs MVP before most players even find their footing, then why is the credit so faint today? Why does that resume not echo the way it should? And the uncomfortable answer starts to come into focus. It was not that McGinnis failed to win. He won in a league that would soon disappear into a merger, taking its colored ball and much of its independent identity with it. An ABA title counted fully on the scoreboard. It did not always receive equal weight in the story basketball told about itself afterward. That theme, winning that did not register the way it earned the right to, is going to follow McGinnis for the rest of his life. And it is about to get even sharper. Because then came 1975, a season that should be remembered as one of the greatest individual years in the history of professional basketball. And almost nobody talks about it. If you want to measure a player at his absolute peak, you look for the season where everything came together. The scoring, the all-around game, the recognition. For George McGinnis, that season was 1974, to 1975. He poured in a career-high 29.8 points per game, and it was not empty scoring. He paired it with a career-high 6.3 assists, which tells you what kind of player he had become. This was a massive forward who could overpower a defender near the rim, handle the ball in open space, rise into his distinctive one-handed jumper, and punish the second defender with a pass. He was not just a finisher, he was an engine. That season earned him the league's Most Valuable Player award. And here is where we have to be precise, because the details matter. McGinnis did not win that MVP alone. He was named co-Most Valuable Player, sharing the honor with Julius Erving in 1975. Two men, one award, standing side by side at the very top of their league. Now sit with the symbolism in that, because it is almost too perfect. At the single highest individual moment of his career, the year he was officially recognized as one of the two best players in his entire sport, his name was tied to Julius Erving. And history would go on to remember Erving with crystal clarity. Dr. J became a household name, a brand, a face of an entire era of basketball. McGinnis, his equal that season by the award's own definition, would slowly drift toward the margins of memory. The award placed them level for one season. Fame would not. Erving's image traveled into the NBA, television, advertising, and a championship. McGinnis's greatest season remained tied to a league that was 1 year away from disappearing. But the award was only half of what made that year extraordinary. The MVP recognized the regular season. What McGinnis did once the playoffs began was something else entirely. A statistical explosion so extreme that decades later it would take Russell Westbrook and Nikola Jokic to match pieces of it. And most fans, even devoted ones, have no idea it ever happened. To understand why his later obscurity feels so strange, stay with what he actually did. This is the run that turns the story from an argument about reputation into evidence. In the 1975 playoffs, across 18 games, McGinnis averaged 32.3 points, 15.9 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. Read those three numbers together. He was a hair away from averaging a triple-double across an entire postseason. 32, 16, and 8. That is not a hot week. That is a sustained 18-game stretch of total domination in every phase of the game, scoring like a superstar, rebounding like a center, and passing like a guard, all at once. And inside that run came a single night that belongs in any serious conversation about the greatest playoff performances ever. On April 12, 1975, against the San Antonio Spurs in Game 4 of the Western Division semifinals, McGinnis put up 51 points, 17 rebounds, and 10 assists. At the time, that line was recognized as the first 50-plus point triple-double in the combined playoff history of both professional leagues. A landmark, a record-setting line for its moment. And to understand just how rare it is, consider this. It would later be matched by Russell Westbrook in 2017, more than 4 decades later. It goes further. Across that entire postseason, McGinnis led all players in total points with 581, in total rebounds with 286, and in total assists with 148. Leading a whole playoff field in all 3 of those categories at once was, at the time, the kind of statistical sweep that almost never happens.
In fact, in the years since, that feat would be matched only by Nikola Jokic in the 2023 playoffs. And when it comes to the rarest play of all, the triple-double, McGinnis recorded more of them than any player in the entire lifespan of his league. 14 in the regular season and 5 more in the playoffs. The statistics give the scale, but not the sight of him. McGinnis could take a rebound in traffic, bring the ball up himself, lean his shoulder into a retreating defense, and force 2 players to make a decision. If they stayed home, he attacked the rim with the strength of a power forward. If they stepped toward him, the same hands that controlled the rebound delivered the pass. Then he returned to the paint and fought for the next miss. The famous one-handed jumper looked almost casual beside all that force. The ball balanced away from his body before leaving a hand defenders struggled to reach. 51 points, 17 rebounds, and 10 assists were not 3 separate performances. They were the same possession, repeating in different forms. And now, the cruel part. Despite all of it, the near triple-double average, the historic 51-point night, the statistical sweep of the entire postseason, the Pacers did not win. They lost the league finals to Kentucky. He gave one of the loudest individual playoff runs anyone had ever seen, and he walked away without the title. He had just produced one of the most overwhelming individual seasons in basketball history. So why did the next 12 months turn into a courtroom drama, a voided contract, and a power move by a brand new commissioner? To understand the mess that followed, you have to know about a piece of business that had been sitting quietly in the background throughout McGinnis's ABA prime. Back in the 1973 NBA draft, the Philadelphia 76ers had used a second-round pick, 22nd overall, to draft George McGinnis. He was already a professional in another league, already a champion, and Philadelphia simply staked a claim to his NBA rights and waited. He belonged to the Pacers on the court, but on paper, in the older league, Philadelphia held the card. The first attempt to cash that card in came in October of 1974. There was a plan to move his NBA rights to the New York Knicks, with the condition that New York sign him before a set deadline. That deal fell apart when McGinnis chose to stay home with the Pacers, signing a 2-year contract that carried an $85,000 buyout clause, a clause that was later exercised after the 1974-75 season ended. Then it escalated into open warfare. McGinnis wanted New York, especially the endorsement opportunities available to a star in that market. On May 23, 1975, fresh off his historic playoff run, he went after the league directly. He sought a preliminary injunction and a restraining order against the NBA, trying to win the right to negotiate freely with any of its 18 teams. This is a player taking a major sports league to court for the right to choose his own employer. In that era, that was bold. That was a man who knew exactly what he was worth and refused to let the system decide it for him. The legal fight, though, did not last long. Just a week later, on May 30th, McGinnis dropped the lawsuit. The reason was simple. He had gotten what he wanted. He signed a 6-year contract worth $2.4 million with the New York Knicks. The court drama was over. He was going to New York. The endorsements, the bright lights, the market he had been chasing, all of it appeared to be his. Except it was not over at all. Because a brand new man had just taken the most powerful chair in the league, and George McGinnis was about to become the very first piece of business on his desk.
The ink was barely dry when Larry O'Brien entered office as the NBA's new commissioner. The McGinnis Agreement was waiting on his desk, and his ruling would announce how firmly he intended to enforce the league's control over player rights. On June 5th, in his first official act, O'Brien rejected the Knicks contract. He also ordered New York to forfeit its first-round selection in the 1976 draft and reimburse Philadelphia for expenses tied to the dispute. The punishment was larger than one blocked signing. It told every team that the new commissioner would defend the league's rules, even if the player at the center of the fight was one of the most valuable stars available. For McGinnis, the institutional message arrived as a personal shock. He had taken the league to court, won the contract and market he wanted, and watched both disappear through a decision made above him. New York had not rejected him. The NBA had rejected the path he used to reach it. So in a matter of days, McGinnis went from a celebrated New York signing to a man whose contract had been erased by the stroke of a pen. New York was gone. The endorsement dream he had chased through a lawsuit and a negotiation had collapsed because of a decision he had no control over. Where he landed was Philadelphia, the team that had held his rights all along. 5 weeks after the Knicks deal was voided, and July 10th, 1975, McGinnis signed with the 76ers. The new contract was even larger. 6 years, $3.2 million, fully guaranteed, with no cut, no trade, and no option protections. It was an ironclad agreement that showed how badly Philadelphia wanted him and how much leverage he still carried after losing the New York fight. So the courtroom war ended, not with McGinnis in the city he wanted, but in the city that had quietly owned his rights from the beginning. He was finally, officially, an NBA player. He was rich, protected, and arriving as a former co-most valuable player, coming off one of the loudest playoff runs the sport had seen. And waiting in Philadelphia was a roster decision that would define his peak and put him directly in the path of the one man whose fame would always seem to outshine his own. When George McGinnis finally pulled on a Philadelphia uniform, he did not ease in. He arrived like the force he had always been. In his first season with the 76ers in 1976, he made the All-NBA First Team, the highest league-wide honor available for a single year. Any doubt that his ABA production could survive the move was answered immediately. McGinnis entered the NBA and was placed in its top tier. Across his 3 seasons in Philadelphia, he would also be selected to 2 All-Star games. The change of leagues did not expose him. It confirmed him. But the most revealing moment of his Philadelphia run did not happen on the court. It happened in a conversation. The 76ers were considering a move to acquire Julius Erving, Dr. J, the most electric attraction in basketball, the man whose fame was about to swallow an entire era. And before they pulled the trigger, both head coach Gene Shue and general manager Pat Williams came to McGinnis. They asked for his blessing. They wanted the team's established star to sign off on bringing in a bigger one. And George McGinnis said yes. He told them he was fine with it. He gave his approval. Sit with the weight of that. Here is a proud man, a former co-king of his sport, a first-team selection, and he is being asked to open the door for the one player who would eventually eclipse him in the public memory forever. He could have resisted. He could have protected his territory, his shots, his place in the spotlight. Instead, he waved Erving in. there was no reason to pretend McGinnis could see how history would divide their fame. What he could see was a chance to place two giants on the same team and chase the championship that had escaped him in 1975. He approved the move. Erving later became the larger public symbol of that Philadelphia era, but McGinnis's decision was not a surrender of his legacy. It was the choice of a star willing to share the stage because he believed the team could win. What he helped build was something the league had never quite seen. McGinnis, Erving, and Caldwell-Jones, three major ABA figures now loaded onto one NBA roster. The team became one of the most discussed squads of its time, and in McGinnis's view, one of the most resented. Years later, he described that resentment in words blunt enough to retain their force. The mid-1970s formed the backdrop.
Black stars were becoming more visible as the face of professional basketball. Salaries were climbing into headline-making territory, and the 76ers were flashy, confident, and loaded with expensive talent from the rival league. McGinnis believed those elements changed the way much of the country viewed them. Years later, McGinnis spoke about how that team was seen, and he did not soften it. In an interview, he said he believed much of white America looked at them as a bunch of big-mouth, cocky, high-priced players, using a far uglier word than that to finish the thought. And then he added the line that lingers: there will never, ever be another team like that. The statement matters because it records McGinnis's own view of the pressure around that Philadelphia team. It should be understood as his first-hand interpretation, not an independently proved description of every motive surrounding the club. In McGinnis's telling, the scrutiny was not only about basketball, it was also about who the players were, how confidently they carried themselves, and how much they earned. That interpretation cannot be imposed on every critic or every defeat, but it belongs in the story because it shaped how he understood the pressure around him. That tension may also help explain why McGinnis never fit neatly into the polished version of the era. His story included money fights, a lawsuit against the league, blunt talk about race, and an unusual willingness to admit how deeply the atmosphere around him affected his game. None of those elements proves why later generations remembered him unevenly. Together, they made him harder to reduce to a clean, comfortable legend. The important point is not to diagnose every person watching him. It is to understand the man being watched. McGinnis felt judgment beyond the scoreboard, and he carried that awareness into the most public pressure of his career. And all of that pride, all of that pressure, was about to collide at the worst possible moment, in the 1977 finals, with his leg numbed by needles and a championship slipping through his hands. The team that drew all that noise also delivered on the court. In the 1977 postseason, McGinnis helped carry Philadelphia to the finals. He averaged 14.2 points, 10.4 rebounds, and 3.6 assists. Those were not the enormous figures of his ABA peak, but they reflected what a contender needed from him: rebounding, playmaking, physical pressure, and production that did not require every possession to end in his hands. And then his body betrayed him at the worst possible time. During the finals, McGinnis suffered a severe groin pull. The injury was bad enough that the treatment sounds almost brutal to describe. To get him on the floor, they used cortisone and xylocaine shots to numb his left leg, from his hip all the way down to his knee. Picture that. A player whose entire game was built on power and explosion, taking the court with half of one leg chemically deadened,
unable to fully feel it, his jumping directly affected by the very treatment meant to let him play at all. He was competing for a championship on a leg that had been switched off. He gutted his way through it. In Game 6, with the season hanging in the balance, McGinnis scored 28 points. He gave what that numbed body could still give. But late in a close game, he missed a shot, and the Portland Trail Blazers seized the moment and clinched the title. What came next told you everything about the man's character. McGinnis did not hide behind the injury. He did not point to the needles or the deadened leg as an excuse. Instead, with painful honesty, he admitted that he had played poorly the whole series. Think about that level of candor from a proud athlete who had every reason to blame his hip and his knee. He took the weight onto himself. He owned the failure publicly. That is the kind of self-blame that can follow a player for years. McGinnis had chased another title since his ABA days, fallen short there, and now fallen short again on the NBA's largest stage, this time with his own body working against him and his own honesty refusing to let him hide behind it. But after a finals loss like that, a quieter trouble was already brewing behind the locker room door. And it had nothing to do with his jump shot, and everything to do with what he was reportedly hiding during practice. Here is where the story takes a strange and very human turn, and where we have to choose our words carefully, because the details come down to us as reports rather than fully confirmed facts. Reports at the time suggested that George McGinnis had been sneaking cigarettes during practice, slipping away to smoke during the very sessions meant to keep a professional athlete sharp. And according to those same reports, the friction this caused ran deeper than one bad habit. It was said that the 76ers had been ready to trade him for nearly a year, largely because of his practice habits. Now hold that against what you already know about his contract. This was the man who had signed an ironclad 6-year deal, guaranteed, no cut, and crucially, no trade. That last clause is supposed to be a fortress. It is supposed to mean that no matter what happens, the team cannot ship you out against your will. And yet here was a franchise reportedly itching to move him for a full year, frustrated by what was going on in practice. So how does a no-trade player end up traded? The simple truth is that contracts are paper, and relationships are real. When a team sours on a star, when the daily friction outweighs the talent, the protections that once made him untouchable start to feel like obstacles to be negotiated around, rather than walls that hold forever. The very deal that announced how badly Philadelphia wanted him had, within a few short years, become a thing both sides needed to get past. It is tempting to ask whether the cigarette story explains the entire breakdown, or merely the part outsiders could see. The record does not permit a confident answer. Reports described poor practice habits and a team that had wanted to move him for months. His salary, personality, public comments, and the disappointment after the finals formed the wider atmosphere, but assigning any hidden motive would be speculation. What can be said is that the relationship had deteriorated far beyond one missed shot. What is certain is the outcome. At the end of the 1977-78 season, the partnership ended. The man Philadelphia had fought a commissioner and a courtroom drama to keep was on his way out the door. The no-trade fortress had not held. And where he was headed next, the altitude was thinner, the team was different, and a freak injury was waiting that would change his body and his career in ways no contract clause could protect against.
In 1978, McGinnis was traded to the Denver Nuggets. The package that moved him tells you he still carried real value. Denver sent Bobby Jones and Ralph Simpson to Philadelphia, along with a swap of first-round picks. This was not a salary dump. This was one good team trading real assets for a player it believed could still anchor a contender. At first, McGinnis rewarded that belief. With Denver, he averaged 22.6 points and 11.4 rebounds, proof that the force of his prime had not vanished. In 1979, he earned the third NBA All-Star selection of his career. A few years removed from his peak, after a contract war, a finals heartbreak, and a messy exit, he was still an all-star and a centerpiece. But if George McGinnis was still producing like a star, why did every stop after Philadelphia feel colder than the one before? The answer was no longer hidden in league politics or contract language. It was beginning to appear in the one place he could not negotiate with: his body. That last part is the catch, because his body was about to stop cooperating in a way that mattered. Near the end of that season, McGinnis tore ligaments in his left ankle. It was a serious injury, and the timing was cruel. It knocked him out of the entire playoffs, the very stage where he had once written some of the loudest chapters of his career. He could only watch. And the recovery did its own quiet damage. His leg was put in a cast, and during that stretch of forced stillness, the weight came. For an athlete whose whole identity was built on speed and power and the ability to overwhelm bigger men, gaining weight while immobilized was more than an inconvenience. It chipped away at the very thing that made him special. The explosion that had defined him since he was a teenager in Indianapolis was being eroded, not by an opponent, not by age alone, but by an ankle and a cast, and the slow creep of pounds he could not run off. The decline was no longer theoretical. The same body built for collision was collecting damage one leg at a time. The numbed hip and knee in Philadelphia, then the torn ankle ligaments in Denver. His power could still appear in the numbers, but it could no longer be summoned on command. And waiting on the other side of all this was a homecoming that should have been a feel-good ending, a return to the city that made him, the hometown that crowned him. Instead, it would become one of the most second-guessed decisions in the franchise's history, and it would cost them a future star. On paper, it had the makings of a perfect ending. A hometown hero, worn down but still meaningful, was returning to the city that had crowned him a teenage legend. The Indiana Pacers, struggling for attention in their early NBA years, needed a draw. They needed someone who could put people back in the seats. Who better than George McGinnis, the boy from Washington High School, the back-to-back champion, the man Indianapolis had loved first? So the Pacers brought him home. And to do it, they traded away a young forward named Alex English. Read that sentence again, because it is one of the most painful in this entire story. To reacquire an aging McGinnis, partly to revive sagging attendance, Indiana gave up a player who would become a multiple-time All-Star and the franchise centerpiece in Denver. English went on to score his way into the conversation of the great forwards of his generation. The Pacers traded that future away to chase a memory. And the memory could not deliver. McGinnis was past his prime, and the numbers told the truth plainly. In the 1980-81 season, he averaged just 13.1 points per game, a shadow of the man who once nearly averaged a triple-double across a postseason.
And when the lights came up in the 1981 playoffs, against the very Philadelphia team that had once fought a courtroom and a commissioner to keep him, he managed only 10 total points across a 2-game first-round loss. The franchise he had hoped to lift home could not get past the first round, and the man brought in to carry them simply did not have it left to give. There is a bitter symmetry running through it. His arrival in the NBA had once cost the New York Knicks a draft pick after the commissioner voided his contract. Now, at the other end of his career, he was the centerpiece of a deal that cost his hometown team a future Hall of Famer. The man teams had fought over so fiercely became the price attached to one of the franchise's most painful trades. And by the spring of 1982, that soured homecoming pushed McGinnis to say something about himself that cut far deeper than any box score ever could. By March of 1982, with his game fading and the joy of the homecoming long gone, McGinnis was asked about where he stood, and his answer was not the usual athlete's deflection. It was a confession. "Being the type of sensitive person I am," he said, "if I don't feel good vibes from the people I'm playing for, I don't shoot well, I don't pass well, I don't do nothing well. If I'd had the inner strength, there's no telling what I would have done. It hasn't been easy for me." The admission explains something the measurements never could. McGinnis looked like a force of nature, yet by his own account, his performance was tied to something less visible, whether he felt supported by the people around him. The power was physical. His access to it could be emotional. When the atmosphere felt right, confidence released everything his body could do. When it turned cold, strength alone did not rescue him. That was an unusually vulnerable thing for an athlete of his era to say publicly. It does not provide one simple explanation for every trade, injury, or difficult season. It does tell us that the Philadelphia friction, the judgment he felt around salary and pride, and the homecoming that turned cold were not background noise to him. The environment entered the game because the player himself said it did. And then it ended, fast and quiet. At the close of the 1982 season, the Pacers called to tell him they would not be bringing him back. There was no farewell tour, no final ovation built around a planned goodbye. The phone simply rang, and the answer was no. He never played professional basketball again, retiring at just 31 years old. Think about that age. 31. A two-time champion, a co-most valuable player, a man who had authored one of the loudest individual postseasons the sport had ever witnessed. Finished before many stars even reached their peak. And already, even as he walked away, the conversation was beginning to move on without him. When the noise of the game fell silent, what came into focus was the man behind the force, a husband, a survivor of early loss, and someone whose own body would betray him slowly in the decades still to come. There was an anchor in his life through all of it, and her name was Linda. McGinnis married Linda Dotson in 1976, near the beginning of his Philadelphia chapter. Their marriage outlasted the championships, the trades, the injuries, and the fading headlines. The two remained together until her passing in 2019. More than 4 decades. Their partnership stretched from the height of his fame to the quiet of his later years. Whatever the public saw, from contract wars and blunt interviews to a proud, sensitive man wrestling with how the world measured him, this was the constant beside him. And then she was gone. Losing Linda in 2019
left him in his final years without the person who had been there through all of it. His own health was declining around the same time, primarily because of back problems, serious enough to require multiple surgeries. The body that had once overpowered grown men, that had played a championship finals on a leg numbed from hip to knee, was breaking down in slow, grinding fashion. On December 14th, 2023, George McGinnis passed away after heart complications at a hospital in Indianapolis. He was 73 years old. He passed in the city that made him, the Saint Indianapolis that had watched a teenager go undefeated, that had crowned him its best, that had loved him first and brought him home at the end. There is something fitting and sorrowful in the location. Indianapolis had watched McGinnis become a schoolboy legend, an ABA champion, and a hometown star. It was also the city where his number remained above the Pacers' floor after the larger basketball conversation had grown quieter around him. His story ended in the one place that had never needed to be convinced of his importance. And yet, in the final stretch of his life, the recognition he had waited on for decades finally found him. Though more than a few would argue, it arrived far, far too late. For most of his life after basketball, the sport's highest individual honor stayed just out of reach. Then, on the 1st of April, 2017, it came. George McGinnis was announced as part of the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame class of 2017, enshrined alongside Tracy McGrady, Bill Self, and Rebecca Lobo. He was formally inducted that September. Do the arithmetic on that, and the weight of it lands hard. He had played his final professional game in 1982. The call to the Hall did not come until 35 years later. We will not pretend to know all the reasons it took that long. But the gap itself is the story. A champion, a co-most valuable player, a statistical giant whose biggest feats waited more than 3 decades to be officially honored at the sport's highest shrine. There was a hometown bookend, too, and a tender one. In September of 2023, McGinnis was inducted into the Indiana University Athletics Hall of Fame, just 3 months before he passed away. The school he had ruled for a single blazing season finally gathered him in, almost at the very end. And in Indianapolis, the honor had already been permanent. His number 30 hangs retired by the Pacers, one of only 4 numbers the franchise has ever lifted to the rafters, alongside Roger Brown, Reggie Miller, and Mel Daniels. In the city that crowned him, his place was never in doubt. So here is where we leave him. George McGinnis won titles, shared a Most Valuable Player award, and produced a postseason so complete that Westbrook and Jokic needed decades to match pieces of it. Across both professional leagues, he scored more than 17,000 points and collected more than 9,000 rebounds. His resume was never the missing part. Basketball simply took too long to decide where an ABA giant, an NBA star, a contract rebel, and a deeply sensitive man belonged in its history. By the time the Hall of Fame answered, 35 years had passed since his final game. The delay belongs to history, not to George McGinnis. He had supplied the championships, the numbers, and the evidence long before anyone built the plaque.